Okay, everybody. So we're moving on to topic 7.4. And so this is going to be primarily about the economy in the interwar years between World War I and World War II. And so basic context of this, there's a lot going on after World War I. Some countries' economies are supercharged by the war itself. The United States is a good example of that. So a lot of the things that they did to make building more efficient in the factories leads to mass production, and it does play and fuel an economic boom after the World War. But for some countries like Germany, things are not going to be so great. So in Germany, talking about them, they are primarily going to start a new government. The Kaiser is no longer there, and you have the new republic known as the Weimar Republic. And the republic, and to make a long story short, is faced with the fact that because Germany was punished in the Treaty of Versailles, they must pay for the cost of the war. And one of the things that they do is decide to print lots of money to help pay for this. But when you do that, it creates inflation. In their case, hyperinflation. So the value of their money became so insignificantly small and valueless that it was actually the paper that it was printed on was worth more than the actual value of the currency that it was being used. And to give you an example of that, you can see in this picture, we have these kids who are using stacks of Deutschmarks to play with as like building blocks because they had no value in them whatsoever. The United States itself during the 1920s has a good economic boom, but long story short, it crashes in the 1930s. And the stock market crashing in 1929 marked the beginning of what becomes known as the Great Depression. And the Great Depression was caused by multiple factors, but when it did occur, it did lead to an economic crisis in the United States, the worst that the United States would have ever seen, has ever seen. And this is going to lead to some changes in how the government approaches the economy in some way. And then the last bit, the Soviet Union, they are going to be transitioning from the rule of the czar to a communist nation. And in doing so, one of the new leaders, Joseph Stalin, is going to collectivize his country in a way that is trying to push them towards industrializing quicker than any country in history ever will. So that is something that does occur, and we'll talk more in detail about that a little bit later in the lecture. Right. So as far as the historical developments, in the language of the curriculum is following World War I and an onset of the Great Depression, governments began to take more active role in the economic life. And so prior to this, we've talked primarily about how the United States and other countries of Western Europe in particular had this laissez-faire attitude about government's involvement in business. The leave it alone, let it be. And it allowed them to benefit from this in a great deal. I mean, lots of money comes into these countries through businesses and transnational businesses, infrastructure building up, and all those things are happening. But once the Great Depression hits, that will change the way that governments behave towards the economy in multiple ways. So kind of going from a less extreme to a more extreme spectrum, we're going to start with the United States. The United States itself is going to transition to what we call neoliberalism. And this is where the state doesn't take over industries. It just simply regulates the industries to make sure that they're doing things that won't lead to problems that could be consumer protection. It could be defrauding investors. It essentially is trying to make sure that the wheels of the free market are going to continue to roll, but there is going to be an oversight by the government to protect people from decisions by businesses that could affect the overall economy. And that's as simply as I can put it, okay? And so when the Great Depression happened in 1929, the president at the time was Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover's belief was laissez-faire economics, that the free market will work itself out. But by the time that he's up for re-election, about a quarter of the population of the United States is out of work, and there needed to be some more drastic steps taken in the minds of the voters. And so they elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Roosevelt is going to be a president that will have no reservations about making the government more involved in trying to solve the economic issues that plague the United States. And his programs were called the New Deal. The New Deal programs were all about helping the government or the economy recover, helping bring relief to those who are suffering from the economic crisis, particularly those who are unemployed, and then reform and to try to change the system to where the problems that created the Great Depression to begin with are going to be regulated by the government. And so I've put a bunch of lists here of all these different programs that the New Deal came about during the New Deal. Some of the big ones would be Social Security, which is giving payments to people 65 years and older once they retire. Now, the reason they do this is to help a portion of the population that was deeply affected even before the Great Depression hit economically, so that they could live a more comfortable life in their twilight years. It is not meant to be an income. It's meant to supplement as an income. So you're not going to get rich off Social Security, but it does help ease the burden of, using your savings that you acquire over the course of the time in which you are working. The other big important part is it's creating an incentive for people who are 65 years and older to leave the workforce. Once they leave the workforce, it opens up jobs for the younger generations, and that's really at the heart of why this is going to happen. So it's a great example of a step, much bigger step that the federal government of the United States will take in involving itself in the economy. Now they're trying to create incentives for people to leave the workforce to open up jobs for next generation. But there's a number here, and you're welcome to read through them and see in different ways in which the government is going to either help the economy recover, relief, or reform. But the bottom line is the New Deal programs, they are going to be a big step in the direction of a government more involved in the economy. And when you compare it to other societies like the Soviet Union, it's a much less dramatic step than what they take. The Soviet Union essentially takes a economy and makes it a total economy, command economy, a better term. And the total command economy, everything is provided for by the state. All factories and agriculture, everything is ran by the state government. But in the United States and most of Western Europe, they didn't do that. They did more something along the lines of democratic socialism. Most of the things that are provided for is done through the free market. However, there are some regulations that the state puts upon private businesses, and then there are some things that are provided by the government as well, like schools. There's a public schools option in the United States, a good example of government involvement in the economy, because everyone who goes through public schools eventually becomes a worker, and that has influence. The next one is the fascist corporate economy. And this is going to happen in fascist states. Now, fascist states we're going to learn more about in the activity that's tied to this. However, just to make long story short, the two main ones you should know about is Benito Mussolini in Italy and, of course, Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. Now, the idea of the corporatist economy goes back to the corporatist theory. Basically, workers and employers would be organized into industrial and professional corporations, and then they would serve as ties to the political representation that is already existing within the government. Essentially, the state is going to give favor to certain corporations as long as the corporations do what the state wants it to be done. And so a good example of a fascist corporate economy would be Volkswagen. Okay, so Volkswagen is a corporation that's still around today, and they're not fascist, but they came around during the time of Nazi Germany and gave favor because the Volkswagen was supposed to create the car for the people of Germany. So the Volk is the sacred people of Germany, the Wagen, the car, so it's the Volkswagen, and that's where it comes and is created from. BMW, another German car maker, came to power and famous during World War II when it was a airplane manufacturer of airplane engines. And if you look at the symbol of BMW, it's the blue and white. So that's just supposed to be the white propellers against the blue sky. And so when you look at that, you can see it. But that was another example of a corporation that was favored with Nazi Germany to build things that were necessary. But as time kind of goes on, the state becomes more controlling and has more say over the corporations what they're manufacturing and building, especially when the war comes around in World War II, because they need war materials to help fight their wars that they were fighting against the Allied powers. So that's something that comes about as a development too. The next thing to talk about is the populist governments of both Mexico and Brazil. And while there's not a lot of information that I could find about each one of these, and you may find some on your own, but basically the populist government is going to see a shift from the power in the very few to the power and opportunities for more people. So these populist governments that come about, start with Mexico. The Mexican Revolution in part happened because there was such an unequal distribution of wealth and land in the hands of very few. Like 1% of Mexico's population owned 97% of the land. And a lot of that land was owned by foreign interests, like their oil fields, which were American companies that ran those oil fields, like ExxonMobil. And as time goes on, the Mexican people are not getting what they see as a fair shake of the resources that are part of their land. They were paid low wages to work on these oil fields and this land, but they were not given a fair shake of interest of the oil that ended up in the profits of these companies. And so when the Mexican Revolution happened, the transfer of wealth and land reforms and such begins to happen in Mexico. So more land reforms take the lands out of the few and put it into the many. The nationalization of the oil industry that was dominated by American capitalists and transnational corporations. That is something that's going to happen in Mexico as a result of these populist policies that occur there. And so this is an example of what happens in Mexico. And something similar happens in Brazil too, but I don't have as much detail about it as I do with Mexico. But bottom line is Brazil, being a Latin American country, had lots of foreign interests and corporations in there trying to gain resources. In Brazil, is the home of the vast majority of the Amazon. And so to combat that, they end up leading to the rise of populist governments in Brazil. This is essentially kind of what happens here. So not too much details that I can provide for you. The PowerPoint kind of talks a little bit about some stuff, but I just don't know if you really need to know too much in depth about this. Just know that the populist governments of Mexico and Brazil occurred as they tried to transfer wealth and land from, foreign interests and very few people to the people of those countries more so. All right. The big one that I do want to talk about more so is the 5-year plan. And there is a YouTube video that is going to go through this for about 10 minutes into a little more detail than I'm going to provide you. And I apologize that it's a little more dry than my lectures are. So if you don't want to watch it, it's not required. But we did watch it in class for those who are interested in seeing it. But the 5-year plans come about as the Soviet Union had fallen far behind Western Europe as far as industrialization goes. When Joseph Stalin comes into power, he really wants to get his country up and industrialize as quickly and as short as possible. And so hence the invention of the 5-year plans. The 5-year plans would then set goals for the country that they must collectively work on to try to meet. And the 5-year plan is going to have significant consequences against the people of the Soviet Union too. So in the first 5-year plan, to long story short, he wants to industrialize his country more so. And part of that was to collectivize all of the factories, all the farmers under the guidance of the government, which at that time would be ruled by Joseph Stalin. So these goals, if they didn't get met, were met with punishments like being sent to the gulags, the labor camps in Siberia. There was also people who, when they resisted, especially peasant farmers, their lands were being taken away from the state and being put into collective farms and such with other, farmlands to meet certain quotas of how much they are going to grow. And when people resisted that, they go to the gulags. So there's not as many people who are making stuff. On top of that, the Soviets, because they were such an agricultural-based economy at the very beginnings of this, they would use their surplus grain to buy machinery from Western European countries and other places that would help benefit them and help with the industrialization. So when there were years that there was a low yield of crops, despite that, the not surplus, but what they did grow was sent for machinery part, but that left a lot of people starving, and there was a mass starvation in Soviet Union as a result, and roughly 10 million people die in the course of this first 5-year plan. So yeah, it does help increase steel production, and it does increase the amount of oil produced and the production of heavy machinery. All these things are true. And yes, the Soviet Union, even though it didn't fully meet its 5-year plan, it definitely put them in a direction where they industrialized much quicker than other countries would in their histories. But at a great cost. 10 million people at least died from these, collectivization and the 5-year plan of the Soviet Union. So there's a way different perspectives of how to view this in history. The Soviet Union helping defeat the Nazis in World War II it's not possible without what happens here. But again, there's such a great cost to it. It's very interesting. It's kind of like looking back and talking about Genghis Khan, good or bad, right? Joseph Stalin, good or bad? I would say bad, but it's just, that's me. That's my opinion. And that's just, how history works sometimes. But with that being said, that is your lecture. You notice that there are no essential questions. But what I would like you to write is 3 things: New Deal, Brazil, 5-year plan. That's your 3 things, okay? So make sure you submit them and then you get credit for it. But know this stuff. Know it, guys and girls. This is really important in terms of understanding this unit itself. Okay. With that being said, this is Mr. Henry signing off.